Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Sarah Seidman, the Puffin Foundation Curator of Social Activism at the Museum of the City of New York. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for an essential conversation, Reimagining Violence Prevention. We are honored to be joined tonight by our moderator, Ashley Southall, along with panelists Erica Ford, Savante Elmyrek, and Danielle Sered. This is the second in our three-part series on envisioning alternatives to policing with Ashley moderating. Our esteemed panelists will examine the programs and techniques that activists and organizations in New York City and beyond have used to foster safety in their communities other than police involvement. You can find more on the series on our website, mcny.org, as well as the recording of the first program in this series on reimagining mental health. Before we dive into discussing our current moment, I'd like to thank the Puffin Foundation for their generous support of Activist New York and its programming, of which this event is a part. And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in. And for those of you who are able to donate for this event, we truly appreciate your support of the museum as we continue to navigate this challenging time. The museum is currently open Friday to Sunday with safety and distancing guidelines in place. Please check out mcny.org, again, for more information and to register for timed tickets, as well as to see our full slate of upcoming programs. And I especially invite you to visit the Activist New York exhibition now or in the future, whenever you're most comfortable, since it is ongoing. Or see the show online at activistnewyork.mcny.org. Both online and in person include a section on the movement for Black Lives, which explores some of the same pressing topics as tonight's program, through objects and images. Closed captioning will be available tonight. You can enable it at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking questions from the audience on Zoom, so you can send along questions that you may have, and we will get to as many as we can in the Q&A function. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Erica Ford has dedicated her life to the liberation of her people from oppression and racism. Her journey began on December 12th, 1987 with the December 12th movement, and she hasn't looked back. As CEO and co-founder of Life Camp Inc., she has played a major role in transforming New York City as an architect for the city's crisis management system, the New York City Mobile Trauma Units, and New York City Peace Week. Savante Elmyrek was sworn into office in January 2012 and became at 24 the city of Ithaca's youngest mayor and first mayor of color. Elmyrek was first elected to the Common Council at the age of 20 while still a junior at Cornell University. His accomplishments include revisions to the city of Ithaca's sidewalk policy, overhaul of stormwater utility legislation, implementation and rehabilitation of Ithaca's downtown pedestrian mall, and changes within the Ithaca Police Department in an effort to improve police and community relations. Danielle Sered envisioned and directs Common Justice, which develops and advances practical and groundbreaking solutions to violence that advance racial equity, meet the needs of those harmed, and do not rely on incarceration. Before planning the launch of Common Justice, Sered served as the deputy director of the Vera Institute of Justice's Adolescent Reentry Initiative, a program for young men returning from incarceration on Rikers Island. And she's the author of The Other Side of Harm, Addressing Disparities in Our Response to Violence, Accounting for Violence, How to Increase Safety and Break Our Failed Reliance on Mass Incarceration, and Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. And finally, but definitely not least, Ashley Southall is this law enforcement reporter focused on crime and policing in New York City, a beat she started working in 2016. She joined the Times in 2008 as a news clerk in the newspaper's Washington bureau. Southall is an alumna of Howard University and an Alabamian. Thank you for joining us tonight for this essential conversation. Please join me in welcoming our panel, and I'll now turn the virtual mic over to our moderator, Ashley. Thanks so much.
Gotta unmute myself. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to everyone who is attending this panel virtually. I know we're all zoomed out, but this is obviously a worthy cause and one that urgently calls for our attention. New York City, as well as many other cities across the country, saw striking rises in gun violence last year. But for years, it has been this epidemic, particularly in American cities. And the impulse in America has been to throw police and punishment at the problem. But I'm going to talk to our panelists today about some alternative ways to prevent and get at violence, and particularly gun violence, in ways that address the causes, and that prevent it before it becomes something where someone is hurt or loses their life. So first, I want to ask each of the panelists how they came to this work. I'll start with Erica and then go to Danielle and Svante.
Gotta unmute myself too. I came to this work in 1987 around attending a rally and realized there was something more to the world than just partying and trying to be fly and hanging out. And also in that same sphere, saw a lot of my friends being killed through the crack epidemic, going to jail for 20, 30 years, and the impact that that had on their family and their loved ones. Wanted to create something to not only break that cycle of violence, but to help people heal from the trauma and address the oppression that we live under. And so I went in and never looked back.
And you, Danielle?
So a few years later in Chicago, I similarly at the height of what we called the crack epidemic then, but was also the moment when mass incarceration was really getting its stride. I saw people going away, and like there was a lot of shame and stigma attached to it, but it was a moment of people who I knew and cared about being removed from the communities, and at the same time a moment of like great levels of violence. So I survived violence. I lost people to violence. I buried far too many people before I was 18 years old. And at the same time, because I was an adolescent, I was an idiot. I got in a lot of trouble. And in facing the consequences of that, I was offered a great deal of mercy. I was a young white girl then, too. And the young men of color with whom I got in trouble were offered no such thing. And so I came to understand the racial disparities of the criminal justice system as somebody who benefited from them. And so I understood that it would then be my job to find people who were fighting those inequities, to join with them in that fight, and to fight until we won or I died, whichever came sooner. And what was so stark then and remains so stark now is the enormous disconnect between the pain and loss of all the violence we were enduring and the complete disconnection and inefficacy in that criminal justice system in doing anything to prevent or mend that harm.
Mm-hmm. And yourself, Svante?
Sure. So I was born in 1987, and my father was, but similar story, Tampa, Florida. My father was in the Navy, started partying, eventually began using crack, disappeared, in and out of the system, but he really disappeared when my mom was 7 months pregnant. And so, he was gone with the rent money. She was laid off from her job. I ended up being born, spent my first 6 months in a homeless shelter. In the first 8 years of my life, in and out of homelessness. And, Danielle talks about the shame. This is something that so many of us in that generation carried, was not just the shame of having parents who used, but the shame of having parents who were arrested over and over and over again, sent through this revolving door of incarceration, and feeling like it was somehow our family's fault or our failing. And it really wasn't until, I ran for office because I wanted to make life easier for poor people in America. I wanted to end child homelessness, and I still do. But it wasn't until really, truly, I was on the city council for 4 years. I was mayor for another 2 before I started to ask myself hard questions, started sharing more about my own story. And that's when I realized so many people in my city, so many people in America would come up to me quietly and whisper in there, oh, yes, my father too. Oh, yes, my mother as well. Oh, my brother's struggling right now. And, I realized that I was in a position to do something about it. So since then, really since 2014, been taking very aggressive stance to replace the war on drugs with a public health and safety approach that actually works to make people's lives better. And now, creating a new modeling of public safety that relies less on armed law enforcement and more on community-based solutions.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of the conversation that that kind of has been highlighted in the last year. The rise in gun violence in America has coincided with very strong calls for police reform, and New York is one of those states where the governor decided that every police department in every jurisdiction had to come up with a plan. So that's something we'll discuss a little bit later. But those plans also there are also calls to deal with these community-based solutions, as the mayor mentioned. And Erica and Danielle are practitioners of 2 methods that have been around for years and that have been studied. Erica does what's called crisis management, and Danielle works in restorative justice. And so Erica and Danielle, if you could just explain to the layperson what those things mean. Can't hear you, Erica, because you're muted.
I went first last time. It's your turn, Danielle.
All right. I'll talk when Erica tells me to talk. It's good advice I'd offer to anybody else. So Common Justice, the organization I direct, applies restorative justice to serious and violent felonies, things like stabbing, shootings, and gunpoint robberies. And restorative justice, the term gets used to describe a lot of things. Once there was $1 for it, everything became restorative justice. But those of us who are really kind of disciplined practitioners of it will define it as a version of a process in which the people most directly impacted by a given harm come together to reach agreements about how the responsible person can make things as right as possible. And it's really important to sit with how fundamentally different that is from our court process, just beginning with the fact that it is a process in which the people most impacted are the decision makers. You go into a courtroom and there is a judge and a prosecutor and a defense attorney and a ton of court staff, and not one of them is the person who suffered the harm. The victim is almost never present. More than 93% of cases nationwide are resolved by plea bargain, not trials. Like, there are more victims in court on Law and Order in a given week than in any courtrooms in New York City. And so we have this idea that we have a victim-centered system, but we don't. We never have. The system is not designed for it. And so the centering of the people most impacted is a critical dimension of restorative justice that fundamentally distinguishes it from the court. And then we say they come together to make a decision about how the responsible person can make things right. So what we otherwise do is people get away with things or people get punished for things. Those are the options we're familiar with. Which of those options is likeliest is extraordinarily racialized in this country and always has been. But even with the option of punishment, we act as though punishment and justice are equivalent, and they're not. And we act as though punishment and accountability are equivalent, and they're not. Like, punishment is passive. Punishment is something somebody does to me. All I have to do to be punished is not escape it. Accountability is active. It requires that I acknowledge what I've done. I acknowledge its impact. I express genuine remorse. I make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed. And I become someone who will never cause that harm ever again. Mm-hmm. The advantage of accountability over punishment is not just that it means people do not have to endure the indignities and brutalities of our prison system. It's also that those people are then compelled to participate in repairing what they broke, like in fixing the harm that they did. As the dignified humans that they are, they owe something. They don't owe that to the state. They owe it to those directly impacted people in the circle. And when they fulfill that debt, it is transformative. And so it transforms them in their lives. It connects them to their dignity and to the best things in themselves. It makes it less likely they will hurt others, which is good for their community. And critically, it makes a contribution to their survivors' healing, that the people who were harmed get validated, they get answers to their questions, they get to shape the outcome of what happens. And all of those things are proven in everywhere from our basic human experience to the most rigorous psychological literature to be exactly the things that help people heal from trauma. And so restorative justice is positioned to actually end the cycles of violence that the courts and prisons are only positioned to perpetuate.
Mm-hmm.
Straight ahead. The work that we do with the New York City Crisis Management System is a comprehensive approach to violence from the lens of public health. And so you are going at its root, and from its root, you are addressing the causes, just similar to COVID, right? And so a layman, you have COVID, you take the COVID patient, you try to quarantine them so that they don't spread the virus. You give them the medicine that they need to heal from the virus. And so each victim, perpetrator of violence is that COVID patient. And you wrap the services around that patient and give them the things that they need, whether it's education, whether it's work, whether it's mental health services. And that's both professional and unconventional, because a lot of times we, in our community, we don't open doors to getting therapeutic services. And that is one of the main, because when Danielle talked about the process of restorative justice, and that is going inside that person and helping them relate to the person that they harmed pain to and the community that they did. And so it's working with those two individuals, both the perpetrator and the victim, to help them heal and transform from what is happening inside of them that makes them look at violence, look at guns, look at knives, look at things to cause harm to themselves or other people. And so that unconventional therapeutic services with the peace mobiles, with our credible clinicians, are one of the main forces of helping to transform those who would become perpetrators of violence. Then we have our interrupters, our outreach workers, who go out and work directly before 911 calls are made with those areas, hotspots, and individuals who have the highest potential to commit acts of violence, and work to dissolve those beefs and conflicts that those groups, gangs, crews, and organizations have. And we're in the hospitals. We work with the victims when they come into the hospital to make sure that they know that there's something else out there. They know that they can, in their most vulnerable time, look to something else to help them make a different decision that got them into that hospital, or help with that family who is going to have to go through their most traumatic time of their life with the loss of a loved one. And so helping them to move through that process, because a lot of times parents stop living once they lose their loved ones to violence. And so how do you help put the oxygen back inside of their lungs? How do you help them breathe again? How do you help them have hope when they no longer want to do anything? And so that is the work of the New York City Crisis Management System. It is 26 sites across the city and over 60, and it's getting ready to go up to 40 something sites, I think. But it's the work of brothers and sisters like Man Up and SOS and Rock Safe Streets and True to Life and all of the different organizations in the various brothers, GMAC, that help to interrupt violence as a collective, co-producing public safety with NYPD in New York City.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all. So now that we have an understanding of what it is that we're kind of working with our panelists, I'd like to coming back to you again, Erica. a lot of these questions will be addressed to you just because you're Miss New York City and you know your stuff.
No, I'm Savant. I'm a fan.
Yeah.
Years old. Oh my
God. I want to ask you, I'm curious about what you've seen over the last year in terms of violence, and what do you think is driving it up? And then I also want to talk to Savante, because Ithaca has kind of seen a similar dynamic. And he's at the same time had to develop a police reform proposal. And I wonder how that's influenced, how the violence and the fear of violence really has influenced that conversation about redesigning police.
I see hurt people the last year. I've seen families who've lost their matriarchs and patriarchs, and that is the access to their income in their households. I've seen people who've lost their incomes, who've lost their jobs, who've lost their ability to live a normal life. And so people in pain will inflict pain on other people without the proper resources to exist. So on top of that, then we came police terror, police violence, anger in the streets. And so you have those two entities of people existent in our community without the proper resources to heal, to release, to transform, to understand. And in the midst of all of that, you're going to have an explosion, right? And that is exactly what we saw, an explosion last summer. And one of the things a news reporter called me today and was asking me about the 29 shootings that happened this weekend. And I said that the problem with Black people in America is that there's no urgency and care to help them heal, to give them the resources that they need to be whole. And so when we look at people analyzing the problem over and over in these government offices, but not putting the resources that they have in an urgent and expeditious kind of way. We had a conversation about expansion a year ago. You know, you can't fix the problem if you don't fix the problem. And so what I see is good ideas, but bureaucracy and politics that don't allow the resources to get to all of the people that need it in the timely manner that they all need it. I might get resources because I got a big mouth, right? But there's several groups across the state, across the nation that need their tools to go do their work. They need more staff. They need more resources and equipment to go out and get to those young people, give them stipends, give them jobs, take them outside where they have to be able to go outside. On the TV, on the thing, we've got a video game next to me, which is kind of a thing, but playing video game, that's old school, right? If they were doing that, that would be okay. But sitting in the house all day on the video games doesn't help them. Sitting in computers all day doesn't help them, right? And so we have to open up stuff and allow our children to be able to go out and release. And so I commend Biden's administration for moving to invest in community-based public safety, but I urge the Senate and the Congress the importance of doing it now. Pass these bills now. Let's not wait till more of our children die to say, oh, we could have, you know, like we got to do stuff. We got to get rid of bureaucracy and politics when it comes to saving lives.
Okay. Savante, you have come up with, under the governor's mandate, you and cities like New York had to come up with reform plans, and some of the issues that Erica mentioned have been things that you've tried to address through this proposal. Do you want to talk about that for a little bit and how the violence affected that conversation?
Yeah, sure. So we undertook 10 months ago our reform plan at the order of the governor, and we set out, we were determined this time to do it differently. I've been mayor for 10 years, which means this is my third go round of reforming the police, right? And what I've noticed in the last two go rounds and what happens in other communities is you will go to vulnerable communities, the houseless, particularly the Black community, and you'll ask them for their ideas, and they will tell you exactly what's going on and what's going wrong. They will tell you exactly ways in which they've been made to feel dehumanized. Even the police will tell you exactly what's wrong, that they are being used for every problem, even if it's not a law enforcement problem, and that their very presence, more so in the last 7 years, but it's always been true, but more so in the last 7 years, because cell phone videos and body cams are catching incidences of violence throughout the country and coloring people's perception of all police officers. So more so for the last 7 years, people are being traumatized by the very presence of police officers. When officers show up, people get defensive, they get reactive, everybody gets jumpier, which is a very dangerous place to be in. But the problem with past reform efforts is you would go to the vulnerable populations and you'd say, what do you want to see changed? They'd tell you. You'd bring this back to the police union. The police union would say, thanks, but no thanks. We're not interested in those. And the elected officials would go, okay, well, we tried. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Mm-hmm. And we made clear from the beginning that the community, especially the vulnerable community, was going to be at the heart of our proposal. And that's why after we crunched all of our data and did all of our focus groups, did all of our surveys and town halls, we came up with a solution that actually replaces our police department with the Department of Public Safety and Community Solutions, right? That will still retain some armed law enforcement officials, but will add a contingent of unarmed public safety workers. We're calling them community solutions officers, all reporting to a civilian who will help build this department from the ground up, creating a culture that focuses on civil rights and social justice. And we found that this was possible to get to, even though crime and violence was spiking last summer and this year. Because as Erica said, the violence is terrible. And just like a virus, it spreads terribly. And so this past weekend, we are still dealing with the ripple effects of something that happened last July, right? Somebody's cousin or brother was upset about a fight or a shooting. It spreads through communities in the same way. So we've been dealing with this for about a year. So what changed last summer, right? Why did violence increase? Getting that answer right, understanding the story of what happened last year is going to help you act properly in the future. You got to understand the lessons that come from stories, because our lessons are where we get our morals. So if the story is people went in the streets and protested against the police, and that emboldened criminals to act criminally, if that's the story you believe, well, first, I think you need to check your data, but also you would say to yourself, what do? We crack down on protests. We add more police officers. That will lower crime. But in Ithaca, we've been doing something of a real life control study, which is that for the last 10 years since I became mayor, my former youth bureau director, a gentleman named Al Green, hand to God, used to say, if you gave the youth bureau the police department's budget, you wouldn't need the police department in 20 years. And, he said it because he was trying to get more funding for his programs. But I always took it to heart. And so what we've done in the last 10 years is actually the police department has shrunk as a percentage of our budget. Number of officers have gone down. Our investment in those social services have gone up every year. And our investment in economic development has gone up every year. So what's happened? Crime decreased year over year. Violent crime and property crime went down every year. What changed in 2020? We didn't lay off a bunch of police officers in the summer of 2020. We did close the schools, right? We didn't close the precincts, but we did stop the after-school programs, right? We didn't lay off the police, but we did take down the basketball rims. People's employment dried up, right? Maybe they were on unemployment, maybe they got a stimulus, maybe they weren't eligible for either, but either way, a deep uncertainty set in, a deep fear about people's place in this economy and in this world. And people were isolated from each other. The kind of things that we've found over and over again, the kind of communities that are resilient and resistant to violence are tight-knit communities where people are, Erica's exactly right. And as somebody who plays video games and loves playing video games, they are a sometimes treat. You've got to get out and get connected to people with youth sports and faith programs. And for myself, the debate club and the chess club and other nerdy type endeavors. Those things all went away last summer. Social connection, economic opportunity, and positive intercommunity engagement. And that's when the violence spiked. So if that's the lesson we learn, right? If we take away what happens if you don't have these things, you can pull a moral from there that says, if we want violence in our community to truly cease, we need to start pouring resources into community solutions. And that's what's at the heart of our new department.
And where does that plan stand today?
Yeah, so just proposed in late February. Council had 6 weeks to pass something on to the governor to either approve it or deny it. On March 31st, right at the deadline, Common Council voted unanimously to adopt the plan, which is thrilling. So now we have to actually implement. Local government, that means committees and task forces and years-long timelines. So we hope to have it implemented in the next couple of years, the new department taking over, but we're not waiting. We're already funding what we're calling a community justice center to tackle much of the work that Erica and Danielle have talked about, and revising and reviewing all of our policies and procedures.
Mm-hmm. There are some who would call the approaches that the three of you kind of talk about, these approaches that deal with, people's jobs and education and things like that, these really soft approaches. And, there are people who say, in this moment, we need harsher consequences. We need more consequences. I mean, you see the police commissioner here himself saying in so many words, lock them up. It's very thinly veiled language. And so I just want to ask Erica and Danielle, Erica, are people right that there need to be more consequences? Are they missing something? And Danielle, I have a separate question for you. Go ahead, Erica.
I think that yes, they're missing something. That you can't consequent pain, right? You're not going to resolve the nature of what made that person do something. Savant laid it out so eloquently. If you take one thing away, you're going to get another thing. You can't keep taking it away and beating me up on top of that and shooting me on top of that and thinking that you're going to get a resolve of a transformation of peace in the community. You're not. You're going to get more anger and more frustration because I don't see you every day. So I'm going to take that anger and frustration and trauma out on the person that is closest to me. It's not black on black crime. It is crime. It is because we live together in this community in which why it participates with me and this other individual. It's not, I don't do the thing to that person because they're black. It is because of proximity, right? And so you got domestic violence increasing, child abuse increasing. And so what we need to do is, like Savant said, is reinvest in what works, reinvest in healing, reinvest in people living. Give people if we go to other communities in Bayside or Upper West Side, it's not taking place, right? You know why? Because they have resources, they have activities. And so let's level the playing field and invest in people, invest in our young people having things to do, having hope and opportunity, and stop trying to criminalize Black people.
Danielle, what about what victims want? What do we know about what they want?
So we get the story about like survivors of violence in this country almost completely wrong. We start by telling it as a story mostly about white women. And I say this as somebody who has survived rape, who has lost loved ones to murder. Like, I am not the poster child for crime victims. A young man of color is 10 times more likely than me to be robbed or assaulted. A woman of color is at least 3 times as likely as I am to survive domestic or sexual violence, right? And so we have a distorted view when we talk about centering survivors about who it is we're centering. What we usually are centering are white women or people who love white women who want harsher punishment. So we see the elevation of the voices of survivors who support draconian responses to violence. We don't listen to the full range. And when we do, we hear something fundamentally different. And what we hear is actually true for white people, for people of color, for people of all genders, which is that people want solutions that work. So like as a survivor myself, right? I know the best way I've been able to describe it is as survivors, we feel pain so deep that we would like wring out our bones to be free of it from like the marrow there. And we feel like fear so all consuming that in the safety of our own homes, in the arms of the people we love most, we cannot sleep. And when exhaustion finally takes us, we wake from it with nightmares. And we feel rage so all consuming, we become unrecognizable even to ourselves. But at the end of the day, we are pragmatic. And there are two things we can't stand. We cannot stand the idea of going through it again, and we cannot stand the idea of someone else going through it. And so if we are presented with an option, we will choose the thing that prevents those things we can't stand. So at Common Justice, we only take cases that if the victims of the crimes consent. It's important to know fewer than half of victims call the police in the first place. So shame on us for pretending that system is victim-centered. Fewer than half call the police in the first place. Another half will drop out before grand jury. So 75% of survivors have already said the criminal justice system does not have what they need. Like, that is a seriously damning indictment of a structure we pretend to be survivor-centered. And then of that remaining quarter, those are the folks we reach out to, people who have had guns to their head, who were hospitalized for days with lacerations to their liver, rendered unconscious, like people suffering lasting effects of trauma. And we say to them, do you want the person who hurt you incarcerated, or do you want them in common justice? And 90% choose common justice, like 90%. And it's a wild number, but it is not a wild number if we think about the pragmatism of crime survivors. Like, our survivors know that they pay for prison's failure with their ongoing pain. Like, if incarceration kept us safe, the United States would be the safest country in all of human history. And East New York would be like the Garden of Eden. Like, in East New York, if a kitten got hit by a car, the whole community would come grieve together. Like, if enforcement produced safety, right? Like rays of light everywhere. It is not what enforcement produces. It is not what prison produces. And we know that. That's not a philosophical debate. We watch it play out over and over. And survivors want to be safe. So I'm not saying survivors hate prison, survivors love mercy, survivors are forgiving. Some are, some do. But survivors are pragmatic. And when they are thinking about their own self-interest, when they are thinking about their own survival, about the survival of the people they love, their brother, their sister, their child, leaving home in a way where they know that person is coming back at the end of the day, they will choose us over incarceration, even as they feel that fear, even as they feel that rage, because they know it is that option that will keep them safe. And that to the degree that politicians mobilize a story about their pain to do something that runs contrary to their interests, shame on them.
I want to talk about what breaking the cycle of violence looks like, because, we've talked about what Erica and Danielle, what it looks like and what we're seeing, but what in a practical way, I'm going to start with Erica again. I want to ask you, can you give us an example that shows like how your work in crisis management differs from what police do, like whether it's how you respond to a shooting or what you do when you hear someone in the neighborhood is mad and has a gun?
Let's go to Ohio. Those young girls were fighting, right? In New York on Supton Boulevard, these girls had a butcher knife in one hand and a bottle of bleach in the other. 25 girls behind her, all brawling, right? It was like 3 staff members of mine. And they go to the center, go to the person and like push them, walk them backwards like, yo, you don't want to do this? You don't want to do this? Like, yo, this ain't worth it. And we talk to them, we connect to them in their rage, nonetheless. We don't look to bring more violence to them, right? Even though they're being violent, because we understand their pain. We connect with their parents. We connect with their trajectory of where this will lead, right? And so we interrupt and we move them out of the situation. And then the young girls over here, I took one and I gave another one to Jamila Davis and Yandy and them from Love and Hip Hop, because they all of that fighting side. Like, here y'all go, work with this young girl, right? And they did. And she owns her own business now. She is teaching other young girls. The other one, both of them own their own business now. And one young girl her mother and her father died before she turned 17 years old. Mm. She was full of rage. So the difference between us and the police is that we come from a place of compassion. We come understanding the pain of our children. We know that they don't want to do what it is they're engaged in. But that is what they know right now. Mm-hmm. And so those two young girls could be just like that young girl in Ohio. Right? And so what we look at is the total picture of a human being who has a right to live. We're going to put you in check. We're going to change your behavioral norms. But we're going to work with this, your heart and your mind. Mm-hmm. Right? And so that's the difference. Mm-hmm. We're going inside of you. Go ahead.
Yeah, the young woman you're talking about in Ohio is Micaiah Bryant, for audience members who may not necessarily know what you're referring to. It's interesting to me, before she's in the foster system. So right away, that there's some issues in her life that led her to that place. And Erica, I want to talk to you about who you talked about your staff members. Who are they, and do they have these experiences as well? Where do they come from, and how do they relate to the people that you're working with?
So like Danielle said, they are formerly incarcerated men and women closest to the problem, right? And so they did 30 years, they did 20 years, they took somebody's life, right? And so they're coming back to the community and fixing the wrongs that they did, and they are working with the people who they influence through the stories in society or just through the behavioral norms that were picked up by these young people wanting to be like that guy, right? And so they have the ability to connect with these young people because they are credible messengers, because they are looked at in a certain way, because they have the tenacity in the credibility and the suave to just come in and not be scared, but also not be disrespected to that individual's pain, because they felt that pain at one day. They didn't have nobody to stand there and grab them. And we were at a funeral, and not to take other people's time, but my staff member looked in this young man's face and said, I was where you were 30 years ago. Don't do it. And that young man to this day says he was getting ready with his friends when he left that funeral to retaliate. And he didn't. He came to us instead. Mm. And now he went an employee, supervisor. He's totally, and they were the quote worst gang in New York City, and the police told me, like, you can't do it. You're not going to be able to get down. But we did, and so it is people who are closest to the problem and have went through the same things, has the same heart that can get to individuals.
Mm. It's striking to me how much of the violence, the gun violence and the violence overall, involves a significant number of kids. When the college student was murdered in Morningside Park in Harlem, those kids were 13 and 14 years old. And last year we saw several people who were arrested for murder who had, they weren't even old enough to buy a pack of cigarettes or beer or to drive. And so the police commissioner, the prior police commissioner said something in a speech a few years ago that has stuck with me, and that there's the city has a list somewhere of kids who under 18 who have been arrested for at least 8 felonies. And so these are youth who are just as involved in the kind of people who both Erica and Danielle work with. And Danielle in particular, I'm interested, and Erica, you can piggyback off this if you'd like. How can restorative justice break the cycle of violence when the children are into it so young?
So I think a couple of things. One is to remember that they're children, right? Like there's really extraordinary research on adultification bias, which is basically the way in which white people see children of color as much older than they are. And it affects the response. It affected what happened in Columbus to that young girl who even in the news gets talked about as a young woman, as a woman, like she was a young girl. And so some of it is for us to actually think about how do we respond to children who are causing harm, and not presume because they're involved in violence that itself has made them adults, and to fight through the ways in which white people in America are conditioned to see people of color as older than they actually are, to be unable to see Black and brown children as children. And so like there's a fundamental work around that bias that is like central to anything we're going to do. Mm-hmm. And then the next thing we have to do is we have to respond to violence with things that reduce violence. That sounds like really infantile, but it is just not what we do. So the core drivers of violence are structural, right? Like to Savante's point earlier, right? The core drivers of violence are things like economic structures, their income disparities, their poverty, inequity, a lack of social service infrastructure, all of those things. But on an individual level, like why one person in a neighborhood who's similarly situated commits violence when another doesn't, the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. The core features of incarceration, shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And so we've baked into our core responses to violence exactly the things that generate it. It's like showing up at a house fire with a hose full of gasoline and being like, I don't understand why these flames keep raging higher. Like it's not honest. And so the thing we do when we want to interrupt cycles of violence is we do things that don't generate violence to begin with, right? Like we start by not adding more pain to the pain. And we do work that is healing, and we do work to hold people accountable. Like we don't actually have to excuse what people have done to affirm their dignity. We can say you are a person deserving of healing, deserving of care, deserving of love. And what you did was dead wrong, and you owe something for it because you are a person of dignity who is capable of contributing to repair. And so I also think it's really important that we not confuse mercy and love with excuse making. It's not dignifying to excuse behavior, right? Like it's not like we believe accountability is an act of love. In adolescence, more than anybody, it's extraordinarily important. And I'll say this quickly and then like reopen the floor. But there is other than adolescence, there's no time before or after adolescence when we are more susceptible to the influence of people around us. And that's important. It's part of human development. Like what's going on is that it's supposed to be the age where we stop getting our moral compass from our parents on the theory that at some point they will die, and instead start to norm our moral compass to our society around us. Like that's what allows us, that's how we start to shift. And so it means at that moment, young people are supposed to be taking their cues about how to be more from their peers than from their parents. Like that's healthy. Kids responding to peer pressure in that way is healthy. It's healthy adolescent development. And so in part, what we do is we put young people with other young people who do exactly the things Erica are describing, who call them on their BS, who lift them up, who affirm the validity of their pain, who like talk to them in ways that make sense to them. So not just credible messengers who had that experience 30 years ago, but 30 minutes ago. And we trust them that their peers are going to not like drag each other down into some pits of violence and gang life, but to elevate one another in ways like only their peer can, especially because of what's happening developmentally.
Mm-hmm. The methods that you and Erica use are, they've been around for years now, but they're now getting a bit of mainstream attention, and particularly from the White House. Erica, you were just there with President Biden announcing his plan to address gun violence. And that included, I think, over $900 million for prevention efforts. I'm curious.
5 billion, let's just get 5 billion.
5 billion for the plan overall, but 900 million is like specifically for community-based interventions. Am I getting that wrong? All right, we're gonna have to scrub that from the Zoom. Go ahead. I'm sorry?
No, it's $5 billion for community-based.
Okay, it's 5 billion. Okay, I just confused about the numbers, but I just want you to talk a bit about whether that signals a real shift in how this country and particularly the government sees gun violence and is willing to treat it. Savante, I also know that you've done some work with administrations on this issue, and I'm curious about whether how the change has looked to you over time, if there's more reception at the local level for these ideas. So go ahead, Erica.
You don't want to start with Savante since he's been so quiet.
Sure. Yeah, which is unlike me, middle child. So I'm just anytime somebody asks me to talk, I'm stunned. I'm like, oh, it's my turn. First of all, I want to co-sign everything that Erica and Danielle said about what survivors need, about accountability, and about how a system like prison is just about the only system that is designed to fail. And we just pretend that it's otherwise. The people who come out of prison are more likely to go back in than people who've never gone to prison at all when you adjust for all other factors, which is just wild. That's like saying if we put you all the way through school and all the way through high school, you'd be guaranteed to have to do the whole thing over 3 years from now. You'd say, then we didn't do it right the first time. I mean, why do we have a rehabilitative system that actually does not rehabilitate? I would offer because it wasn't actually designed to rehabilitate, that these systems get the outcomes that they were designed to, which is, de facto and legal segregation. It's a way of saying, we don't want those people here, so put them over there, even if it doesn't make their lives better or increase feelings of safety. And I also just want to co-sign something that Danielle said about studying families that are resource rich. I think there's far too much sociological research into the poor and not enough into the wealthy. Because I can tell you that what Tyler, my friend growing up, when he got in trouble at 14, because wealthy kids have all the same, wealthy kids will have ACEs too. They will have sensation-seeking behaviors. They are young and they will get into trouble. And when they get into trouble, their families don't seek punishment and district attorneys don't seek punishment. Instead, that's when they begin cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's when they begin intensive forms of rehabilitation, going away to school, the kind of interventions that actually work. And so if we just did for every family what Tyler's family did for his, we'd all be far better off. Now, I will say this administration, not just the Biden administration, but every mayor and city council that I work with, and I work with quite a lot, are far more interested. I'll take you just behind the scenes a little bit into the world of mayors, and that if you ever end up becoming a mayor, which I recommend, just not Ithaca, this one's taken. The fastest way, if you go to like the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and they'll stand in a circle. Some of them have been there a long time. And I went in 2012. That was my first conference. And the way to, you walk up to them and go, geez, really tough to manage a police department, huh? Mm-hmm. The mayors go, oh, yeah. And they welcome you into the circle just like now. And this is from Tulsa, Oklahoma to Seattle, everywhere in between. And that's not just about racial justice, right? It's not just about stopping police violence. It's about the difficulty and culture of managing and operating police departments. And every mayor I know in city council is interested in making these departments more democratically run. That is to say, actually operate with the permission of, approval of, and cooperation of the community, which is not how most police departments operate now. They operate sort of as well, that's not the way they operate now. So I am seeing very promising signs from cities all over the country and the Biden administration, especially. I'm seeing an extremely promising willingness to fund not just alternatives to policing and alternatives to incarceration, but recognizing that delivering huge stimulus is itself an anti-violence proposal, and that taking care of people's fundamental needs by supporting those checks and fighting to make them recurring, enhancing unemployment benefits, and maybe if it lasts, might be the largest legacy of this presidency and several presidencies to come, which is the Social Security they've now created for children and that tax benefit of $500. I think it's $500 a month that goes to families. Those things will do more to decrease violence than anything that can be done at the local level. I believe that.
Mm-hmm.
It's balancing the playing field. You know, it's given, when you talk about the research into the wealthy, it is balancing the playing field. People who don't have nothing can't do nothing, you know. And Susan Rice, when we met with Susan Rice and Congressman Cedric Richmond's team, Susan Rice took it the mantle and ran with it and said that she would be a champion, and she was a champion. And her team worked vigorously to listen to what folks thought was needed, look at what is missing, and fill the gap, you know, and advocate for what is needed. And we saw that with not only the $5 billion that was put into the jobs bill, but the 5 agencies, 26 programs, where there's another $5 billion that is being accessible to people on the ground to do the work. And then the appropriation funds that are being released for community-based work. And then also the encouragement of mayors and governors to use the American Rescue Funds to put into community violence prevention. So altogether, it's around $11 billion that the Biden administration is looking to put into community-based violence, a public health approach of violence prevention, and to help people, victims, recover from or transform, heal from the impact of violence, on top of the bills to ban the ghost guns and the other AR weapons. I think that,
go ahead.
No, that's I just was, I think that they the years of work and the people in the street gave life to what happened in the Biden administration. You know, it is him standing on top of Obama and his gun violence prevention task force that he led, you know, and seeing nothing done and more people killed. And then all of the people in the street and the activists and the conversations led him to today.
Yeah. I want to ask Savante and Danielle and Erica, well, mainly Savante. I know we have just a few minutes and I have a few more questions. Savante, I'm curious about how the police feel about all of these changes, how they've responded. Can you address that?
Yeah, well, the union waged a sustained campaign against the changes. They enlisted the help of the NYPD police union to come up and fight against the changes in Ithaca. Suffolk County Police Association, which I don't know if you know, actually has a super PAC. That's how big and politically powerful that association is. But they ultimately, through a series of meetings and very honest conversations, I mean, I think they were just stunned at first. I think they were just shocked. And these are changes, you understand, these men and women in our department, you know, this is a job that is more than a job. It's even more than a career. For a lot of them, it becomes an identity. And so any changes to it, especially a fundamental one that adjusts the mission and tries to change the paradigm under which they're working, can be seen as threatening. And so I understand that. We've been meeting basically weekly for the last 2 months and coming to some common ground. They understand and are respecting that Common Council voted unanimously to move forward. So they want to figure out how they fit into that new system. And it's been useful and productive. But it was definitely a shock to the system. I think, too, especially to the NYPD and the Suffolk County PBA, they're used to saying, if we don't like it, it doesn't happen. And we had a different attitude going into this process.
I'm just going to shift to a different question because Danielle, someone in the audience has asked if you could describe some examples of an example of how people affect accountability.
Sure. So in addition to the steps of sort of acknowledging what you've done, acknowledging its impact, expressing remorse, the things in common justice that people will do to make it right generally fall in three categories. Like there is one category that is things people do for the person they hurt. So that's writing apologies to them, to their families. It's paying restitution. It's returning or replacing things that were stolen. It's acts of kindness to them and their families. The second category is things that will change them, that will increase the likelihood of the survivor's basic desire to know they'll never hurt them or anyone else ever again. So pursuing employment, pursuing their education, getting therapy, getting support, healing through their own pain, like doing things that are required and expected of them and that position them to have a living wage that never requires hurting anybody else, to have a roof over their head for the rest of their lives. And then the last thing is usually things that are about paying it forward. So people who talk to young people to persuade them of the value of pursuing a different path than the one they chose, doing community service in a place that means something to the person who was hurt. But I think the thing that's important is that these are really unique to each case. So like in one case where someone was held at gunpoint and robbed and really believed that he would lose his life, in our circle process, he said to the person who robbed him, I want you to meet the kids whose father you almost took from them that night with your gun. And I believe today in the father you can be to your baby girl. And I want to say that to her face. And so we're like convening these families to address it together. We had a case in which the person who committed a mugging taught the survivor of that mugging self-defense techniques in a way that made a greater contribution to the resolution of his trauma than anything the court could have ever done or imagined. And so part of what is important about those agreements is that they aren't the same every time, that they are built into like whatever is of meaning and value to the people who were hurt.
Mm. So I have one more question for all of the panelists, which is what I would like to consider my action item question. So there are several elections going on right now in New York. There will be elections for years to come. I'm sure these kinds of issues don't disappear overnight. So in New York City, we have a mayor's race, city council seats. I'd like for each of you to talk about what the biggest challenges are to moving toward this more holistic response that you all work in or have worked toward, and what should voters be asking candidates and looking for in them? And then, of course, Savante, you have a special question because you're in office. Any advice for the next mayor and lawmakers trying to address gun violence? So I will, let's just go in alphabetical order. Danielle, then Erica, then Svante.
So I think, one of the things is in thinking about when people are talking about reforms to the criminal justice system, does their vision for reform include crimes of serious violence? Mm-hmm. Like, does it stop at low-level misdemeanors? Does it stop at the things that seem readily like palatable and easy and that we've been talking about? Or are people ready to say, we're going to envision something else, even for real harm? And then is their vision for that transformation big enough? Like the amount of money Erica and the Fund Peace Collaborative secured is extraordinary, unprecedented, and half of the NYPD's annual budget. Nationally, half of the NYPD's annual budget. And so we also, I think, have to listen for like mayoral candidates who understand like the scale of the problem and are proposing a solution at a scale that is comparable. So a program that's like, we have a new $150,000 mini grant pool is not what is going to get us out of it. And so to really listen for bravery, for scale, and fundamentally for accountability to the people. Who are they going to answer to and how? Who do they think are their constituents? Because if you want to predict what someone will do, look at who they think they answer to, and you will know the actions they'll take. So far more important than their policy platform is going to be the constituents that vote them in.
Yeah, that's very true. I see a lot of the politicians they cater to the voter, right? The person who comes out every time and vote. They really don't care about, a politician said to me a long time ago, he said, if it wasn't for you always knocking down our door with all of these young people, we wouldn't do anything about this. They don't vote. They don't mobilize voters. They don't invest in our campaigns. We would not be doing anything about this issue. And so when you look at a candidate, don't look at what they say, because they all got good speech writers and say the right thing. Look at who is around them. Where are they putting their money? Who are they spending most of their time with, right? Look at their historical footprint to see where they put their money. Who did they spend their time with? What did they use their voice to lift and transform, right? Too often we go for what's easy. For the new mayor that's coming into office, you got to be audacious. You got to have the tenacity to say to an NYPD commissioner, like Savante just said, who's going to say, or police union head, who says, what I don't like is not going to happen. You have to be powerful enough in your own skin to say, you're fired. You're fired, you know? And there's other plans and ideas that you can do to remove those who don't agree with the people have the right to have the power to live free of violence. And the way I know that you believe that is you don't talk it, you don't do press conferences. I don't care if you ever did a press conference. Put your money now where you say it needs to go. Because last June, people said that. We keep having meetings after meetings after meetings about how our budget is going to be doubled and increased and this and that. It's not, it hasn't happened. And so people win campaigns on great speeches about our children's death. They show up, but they don't care. And so you have to value your vote. We got to really value our vote and turn this system upside down. Turn it upside down. Because Savante didn't get in office at 20-something years old because he just did a great speech, right? That's some or that's some stuff I can't say on right? But that's what we need to do. The one that you think that we shouldn't vote in, that's who we need to vote in. Because the system needs to be shaken up. It needs to be shaken up, and resources need to go to the ground.
And
I couldn't agree more. I tried to mentor this last mayor when he came in, and he was the new guy on the block. And I'm happy to offer my same mentorship to whoever is the next mayor of New York City, because I'm sure they'll need it from the mayor of Ithaca. The truth is that there are a lot of opportunities to fold when no one's looking. And the pressure is enormous. It's for any mayor, for the mayor of New York City, 10 times so. You know, Mayor Bloomberg was an interesting contrast because you couldn't hurt his feelings. He once told me, he said, my advice, before you become mayor, become a billionaire. And that obviously worked for him because you just couldn't, you know, there was no way. He knew what he wanted and he stuck by it. You need a mayor like that, right? Find somebody whose values align with yours, not because they're a billionaire, but whose values align with yours, that you have a sense will not fold when you're not watching. Because most of our job, no one's watching except the people in the room, from the meetings with the police commissioners to the union heads to one quiet conversation after another. There's opportunity after opportunity to take the safe route instead of the right route. So find somebody who thinks God's spine.
All right. Thank you all for your input. This has been, I've learned something. I've taken vigorous notes. And I just appreciate you all for taking the time to come out tonight, and as well our audience. I hope that you have taken something from this conversation that you can use in your life to work toward your goals for a safer New York and a safer America and world. With that said, I'm going to turn back to Sarah.
Thank you, Ashley. And yeah, thank you, Erica, Savante, and Danielle. This has been such a powerful and catalyzing conversation. I think that's a police helicopter over my apartment building. One that, we should certainly keep having, that you all are undoubtedly having. And of course, parts of this will surface again in our next program on envisioning alternatives to policing and reimagining quality of life in public spaces on May 26th at 6 p.m. So please tune back in, and thank you so much to our panelists. And Ashley, thank you for joining us, and good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.